most of you know each other, and most of you know our speakers. Not all of you may know Sam Blumenfeld as well. He is a member of the Chalcedon staff. He lives in the Boston area. He is probably the foremost expert in the United States on the history of public education in the United States, going all the way back to the founding of this country. And he is also an expert on the teaching of reading in particular and phonics. He has written a number of books: How to Start Your Own Private School and Why You Need One, The New Illiterates, How to Tutor, Is Public Education Necessary?, Alpha Phonics, a primer for beginning readers, and NEA, Trojan Horse in American Education. He has lectured extensively in this country as well as in Europe and Australia, and we are honored to have him here this morning.
Well, it's nice to be back in Vallecito. I try to get here at least once a year so that I can keep in touch with the Chalcedon staff, and also just to enjoy your wonderful climate in this beautiful part of the country. What I'm going to talk about today is just give you some of the latest findings on literacy and the reading problem in America, which, as you know, is ongoing, and most people don't understand why we haven't been able to solve it yet as a nation, why the nation persists in this literacy decline and in the increased incidence of dyslexia and reading disability that we find throughout the country and in virtually every school district. When I wrote my book, The New Illiterates, back in 1973, I did a line-by-line analysis of the Dick and Jane reading program. And I came to the conclusion that any youngster who was taught to read by that method exclusively would probably exhibit the symptoms of dyslexia. In other words, the method itself, the teaching method, would cause dyslexia. Now, what are the symptoms of dyslexia? Well, of course, the word itself simply means poor reading, bad reading, and what dyslexics usually do is that they will reverse letters, they'll read words backwards, they have very low phonetic knowledge or very little phonetic knowledge, and they read very poorly. They will skip words, they'll guess words, they'll truncate words. For example, if they see a word like telephone, they'll say phone. Or if the word says newspaper, they'll say paper. They substitute words. If they see the word horse, they may say pony, because they've been taught to look at words as little pictures. They've been taught to look at our English alphabetic words as little pictures, as ideograms or ideographs. And naturally, when you look at a picture, you don't necessarily look at it from left to right. What you do is something attracts you in the picture, and you go to it, and then you look at the rest of it. Children who are taught to read by the look-say method are taught to memorize a sight vocabulary. Now, what is a sight vocabulary? Well, by definition, a sight vocabulary is looking at an English word without knowing that the letters stand for anything. You're supposed to look at the word as a whole configuration. So, and if you've had no alphabetic training, if you haven't been taught that the letters stand for anything, and you're confronted with a sight vocabulary, and you've got to memorize each word as a little picture, well, how does a child memorize these words? How does a child remember what the words say? Well, any way they can, any way that's possible. In other words, something at the end of the word may remind the child of it, something in the middle of the word, something at the beginning of the word, and so they don't have a set way of looking at the word. In other words, they've got to develop a means that would bring recall, so to speak. And so naturally, they're not going to read from left to right, as a phonetic reader does. A phonetic reader must read from left to right because that's the only way that he or she can translate the letters into sounds, and it's from left to right. That's the sequence in which the sounds are uttered, from left to right, and the letters, of course, reflect that. But if you don't know that the letters stand for anything, and they're just a bunch of arbitrary symbols arranged in a totally arbitrary manner, then you're going to look at this configuration and try to find something in it that will help you recall what the word says. And that's why so many of these so-called dyslexics read words backwards or reverse letters, because it doesn't matter to them. You know, for example, take a word like best, B-E-S-T. Well, a dyslexic might look at that and say bets, because he sees a B and he sees a T and an S, and he doesn't understand that if you put the S in front of the T, it has a different, the combination is different if you put the S after the T, you see. And so that's why you get so many terrible misreadings, because they don't understand the significance of our alphabetic writing system. It has not been taught them. Now, the reason why they have little phonetic knowledge is because they haven't been taught our phonetic system, our alphabetic system. And our alphabetic system is an ingenious system based on a great discovery made many thousands of years ago. I would say probably about 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years BC. As you know, prior to the invention of the alphabet, the method that was used to read in those days, or write, the earliest form was known as pictography. The cavemen drew pictures on the walls of the caves, and you didn't have to go to school to be able to read those pictures. You know, they were obvious. An animal looked like an animal, a man looked like a man, a bow and arrow looked like a bow and arrow. So you didn't have to go to school. But as civilization became more complex, the scribes had to begin drawing pictures of things that did not lend themselves to depiction. I mean, after all, how do you draw pictures of good and evil, right and wrong? How do you draw pictures of abstractions of, for example, take for a notion like system. How do you draw a picture of a system? You can't. How do you draw a picture of a concept such as determine? You can't. So what do? You draw a little picture and you say, this stands for determine. Doesn't look like determine, but it's determine. And so the scribes drew thousands and thousands of pictures, none of which looked like anything they represented. You see, in pictography, the symbols look like the things they represent. In ideographs, they don't look like the things they represent. And of course, a prime example of ideographic writing is Chinese. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Chinese symbols, and none of them look like anything they represent. As a matter of fact, they're totally incomprehensible to anyone who has not studied them very closely. Well, the scribes created these thousands of symbols, none of which looked like the things they represented. They required many years of study to master. And so literacy was restricted to a small group of scholars and priests and scribes. And it's interesting, though, that the power of the government was in the priests and the scribes, those who had the literacy, those who knew how to read and write these ideographs, because they had the knowledge. You see, it was in their hands, and therefore the pharaohs and whoever ruled was really at the mercy of his scribes. And so it represented tremendous power in that kind of political setup, that kind of a society. Well, around 2,000 years BC, somebody made a remarkable discovery. We don't know who that person was. Somebody discovered that all of human language, everything we say, is really composed of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. And that person said, well, instead of using this cumbersome ideographic system comprised of thousands and thousands of symbols, none of which look like anything they represent, why don't I create a small set of symbols to stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language? And then we will have a very simple means of transcribing the spoken word directly into written form, and an equally simple means of translating the written word back into its spoken equivalent. And so the first alphabet was invented. Now they say, they have never been able to corroborate or to establish exactly where the alphabet originated. They say that the Phoenicians invented it for commercial purposes. There are no records of Phoenician writing, but somehow the historians have decided that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet. And of course, the Phoenicians lived in an area which would now be known as southern Lebanon or northern Israel. But the interesting thing about that is that even before the alphabet was invented, there were already uses of words or symbols for phonetic purposes. Egyptian hieroglyphics, for example, was evolving, and many of the symbols of the Egyptian hieroglyphs were used for phonetic purposes to remind you of a sound. It's the same with Chinese. People assume that all of the Chinese symbols are just ideographs and that they don't have any relation to a phonetic, to a sound value. But the Chinese also had to use some of those symbols for phonetic purposes simply because it's impossible to develop a writing system without some reference to the sounds of the language. So even Chinese has developed a very complex phonetic system, which they use, for example, in order to write foreign names, like Philadelphia. How do you write Philadelphia in Chinese, you know? So and it's the same with the Japanese. The Japanese have a combination of phonetic symbols and ideographs. Now, we have some ideographs in English that we use. The dollar sign, for example, is an ideograph. Or the number sign that they now use on the telephone. Those are ideographs, but we don't use very many of them. But occasionally you'll see them interspersed in our printed material. For example, it'll say, nowadays they will say that company made $5 billion last year. Now, they don't spell out 5 billion. What they do is they'll put up dollar sign and a 5, number 5, which is also a hieroglyph, incidentally, a dash, and then they'll say billion. They'll spell out billion. So when you look at it, you see $5-billion. That says $5 billion. You just read it as 5 billion instead of having it spelled out. If you spelled it out, it would be totally phonetic. F-I-V-E, billion. D-O-L-L-A-R-S. But they don't bother to spell out dollars. They'll put the dollar sign. And you just automatically will say 5 billion rather than dollar sign 5 billion, etc. Now, it's interesting that a phonetic writing system refers to the specific language of the writer. For example, F-I-V-E stands for the English word 5. The hieroglyph 5 can be read in any language. In French, it's cinq. In Spanish, it's cinco. Is that it in Spanish? Cinco? In Italian, it's cinque. In German, it's fünf. So in other words, the symbol actually can be read in different languages. As a matter of fact, these days now we're using a lot of hieroglyphs and ideographs in airports because you've got all of these people from different countries and they can't read English. And so now when you go into an airport and you want to go to a restroom, you have to look at the little picture on the door. And you'll have one little picture shows somebody with trousers, and another, you have a picture with somebody with a skirt. But since many women wear trousers these days, I wonder if some of them are confused and maybe going into the wrong door. But the word gentleman cannot be confused with lady. In other words, hieroglyphs can be very confusing. They can be ambiguous as well. And so you might say that the most important thing about alphabetic writing is its accuracy. It is a very accurate, precise system because it is simply recording the spoken language exactly as it is spoken. Now, as I mentioned, they say that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet for commercial reasons. And yet, what was the most important thing which occurred as soon as the alphabet was invented? The scripture began to appear, you see. The scripture is written in alphabetic writing. As a matter of fact, when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he had been taught Egyptian. He was brought up by an Egyptian princess, although I believe his mother sort of was put in charge of him, wasn't she? So maybe he learned to speak Hebrew, but I don't know if she knew how to write Hebrew or whether they were writing it in those days. But in any case, Moses went up to Mount Sinai and got the Ten Commandments. And how did God write the Ten Commandments? You know, with his finger. He wrote it in alphabetic writing. Now, who taught God the alphabet? It's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, God wrote alphabetic writing. Now, the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, believed that the alphabet was of divine origin, because Moses came down with tablets written in alphabetic writing, which has never been explained. Nobody's explained. I believe that was why the alphabet was invented, because the Word of God has to be read precisely and accurately. You can't play around with it, although today's scholars do. You know, our deconstructionists are trying to do to the English language or to English writing as what can be done with hieroglyphics. You know, but you see, man had to wait until the alphabet was invented before the Word of God could be given to him, because God does not speak in ambiguities. You know, God's Word is quite accurate and precise, and as a matter of fact, the Bible says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's the equivalence of the Word with God. If God is the Word, why is God the Word? Well, how did God create the world? He said, let there be light, and there was a light. Right? It was in the Word. God did not hire an electrician. He did not hire a contractor. If he had, we wouldn't have this beautiful planet, would we? We'd have a contractor's version of it. It would be more like Disney World, wouldn't it? But in any case, it's interesting that we equate God with the Word, and the Word, of course, is so important to have it in alphabetic writing, because that is a direct transcription of the Word, and the Bible is written in alphabetic writing. Now, the alphabet, of course, had tremendous advantages over ideographs and hieroglyphic writing. First of all, it speeded up the transmission of information, because it was so much easier to learn to read. Everybody could learn to read. And how do you teach a child to read an alphabetic writing system? Well, for generations, it was taught in the simplest manner possible. You first taught the child to recognize the letters of the alphabet, and then you taught the child the sounds that the letters stood for, and that was done over the generations by a very simple rote routine. What they would do is teach the child the consonants and the vowels sounds, and then they would combine the consonant and the vowel, and they would drill the child in those combinations, such as bay, bee, bi, bo, bu, may, me, my, mo, mu. Now, when they were teaching the short vowels, they would put the vowel in front of the consonant, ab, eb, ib, ob, ub, am, im, um. And if you look at the primers that were used not only in the early days of this country, but back in Roman times, that's how it was done. They were drilled in the letter sounds. Now, why was that? Why was that necessary? Well, because the essence or the heart of learning to read an alphabetic writing system is having that automatic association between letters and sounds. And so the drill helped children develop this automatic association between letters and sounds, so that when you see the letters, you hear the sounds. You see, that's the proper association when you're learning to read an alphabetic writing system. Is not, the letter A does not stand for an apple. It stands for A. you see, or A, depending on the spelling form you're using. Now, as I said, that all of human language is composed of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. Well, how many irreducible speech sounds do you think there are in the English language? And I'm sure that many of you already know this, but there are 44 sounds in English. Now, why do we have a 26-letter alphabet? Well, apparently what happened was when the Romans conquered the British islands, the Romans or the Latin-speaking individuals imposed the Latin alphabet on the people who were living there. And the people who were living there adapted the Latin alphabet to their needs. Now, if you're going to take a 26-letter alphabet to stand for 44 sounds, you're going to have some problems. Some of your letters are going to have to stand for more than one sound. Some of your sounds are going to have to be represented by more than one letter. And of course, that's what happened in our writing system. For example, the letter A stands for at least 4 different sounds. It stands for the long A as in apron or April. It stands for the short A, the A as in cat or bat. It stands for the R sound as in car or far, and it stands for the O sound as in all or ball. And how does a child learn which sound is called for when he sees the letter A? Well, if you teach the letter sounds in their spelling families, the children generally learn very easily which A to articulate when they, which sound of A to articulate when they see that particular word. It hasn't posed any great problem. The English alphabetic system has produced the world's greatest literature. So yes, we do have some spelling problems, but our spelling problems are mainly due to the fact that English is such a conglomeration of Anglo-Saxon, Norwegian, German, French, Latin, Greek. There's so much in English from other languages that the reason why we have these different spelling forms is so that we don't lose track of where these words came from. You see, there's a lot of history in our spelling. The spelling helps us understand the derivation of the word, because if we spelled everything absolutely phonetically, as they do in shorthand, if any of you are familiar with Pittman shorthand or with Gregg, you will know that it's a purely phonetic system. But if you look at our spelling forms, then you get an idea of where that word comes from, whether it's of Latin derivation or Greek derivation or French or whatever. So there's a reason why we've had that problem. Now, of course, the educators have taken these problems to be so monumental that they said, well, we ought not to burden children with having to teach them that. What we ought to do is simply have them look at the words as little pictures and try to teach them to read in that way. But there's much more to it than that. Back in the early days of the progressive movement, when the progressives took over American education, their aim, of course, was to change America from a capitalist, individualistic, believing nation into a socialist, collectivist, atheist nation. The progressives were socialists. John Dewey, of course, was their, you might say, their philosophical mentor, or he was the one who saw it in, you might say, in the deepest philosophical sense. He was a Hegelian. He was a Platoist, and drew many of his ideas from Plato's Republic and also from Hegel. Of course, Hegel's view of society also was derived, in a sense, from Plato. But in any case, they were socialists. Now, why were they socialists? First of all, who were the progressives? Well, these were members of the Protestant academic elite who no longer believed in the religion of their fathers. They rejected their upbringing. Many of them came from deeply religious Christian homes. James McKean Cattell's father was a Presbyterian minister and a president of Lafayette College. John Dewey was brought up his mother was quite a religious woman, evangelical. He was brought up in the New England tradition. He taught Sunday school as a youngster. I think Thorndike's father was also a minister or a missionary. So they knew their Christianity very well. They knew their Bible very well. These men were brought up in the biblical tradition, yet they rejected the Bible, they rejected Christianity, they rejected religion, mainly, and now they put their faith into science, evolution, and psychology. You see, science permitted them to know the material world, matter and motion. That's all that the material world was, matter and motion. Evolution explained the origin of man, that man arose out of the primordial ooze with the rest of the creatures, and that explained the origin of life, as far as they were concerned. And of course, psychology permitted them to understand human nature, to study human nature in a scientific manner. So not only would they understand human behavior, but also they would develop the scientific means to control human behavior, you see. So they had it all, and they discarded religion. Now, they embarked on this messianic mission to change America from a capitalist, individualist, religious nation into a socialist, atheist, and collectivist society. Now, why did they have this messianic mission? Why were they so driven? Well, you see, as I said, they came from good Christian homes, and they were determined to prove that they were right and that the Bible was wrong. Particularly on many, for example, on the matter of man's nature. They were determined to prove that there was no such thing as sin, that man was not innately depraved, that he was a perfectly wonderful, natural being, that he was really, it was society that had corrupted him. But in a socialist society, you'd have a totally different kind of individual. You'd have they would be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt by socialism that man was not innately depraved, was not innately sinful, that he was a wonderful, wonderful creature, and that crime would disappear. You'd have, all of the ills of society would be eradicated by this new environment. You see, they believed that it was capitalism that produced all these horrible things. Competition, self-centeredness, selfishness. And they said, if you get rid of that force that creates these economic inequities and pits one individual against another, you will see a cooperative society. You'll see individuals living on a totally different level. And they were determined to prove that this was the case. And the only way they could do that was to bring about socialism. They were determined to prove that they were right and the Bible was wrong. Why? Because they knew that if the Bible was right and they were wrong, they knew where they'd be going. So they had a very powerful incentive to prove that they were right. And the only way they could do that was to actually bring about socialism. Now, these were their thoughts in the 1890s and early 1900s, before the Russian Revolution. Socialism is an old philosophy. It goes back to Plato, of course. But in this country, they've been thinking along those lines for quite a while. And so these men, they said their socialism has never been tried. We're going to prove that it works. And so they embarked on this messianic mission to change America. Now, John Dewey wrote a very interesting essay in 1898 in which he more or less claimed that the one thing that keeps the capitalist system, the individualistic system, the religious system going is our form of education with its tremendous emphasis on language learning. He said high literacy was antisocial because it produced people with this independent intelligence who could stand on their own 2 feet and think for themselves. And he said, also, high literacy produces people who can curl up in a corner with a book and not care about the collective. They're not going to do group work. They're not going to operate as a collective. They're individuals. He said, high literacy is the culprit. That is causing individualism. That's the underlying basis of individualism is high literacy. And he said, we've got to get rid of it. Now, how are they going to get rid of it? Well, he said, simple. We'll simply change the way reading is taught in America. We will teach children to read by this look-say method, by an ideographic teaching technique, and that will lower the literacy level of the country. And that's exactly what they did. By 1930, the Dick and Jane books were ready. The Macmillan readers were ready. All of these books, incidentally, came out of Columbia University or the University of Chicago, where all of these ideas were dominant. Dick and Jane, of course, was written by, the editor was William Scott Gray, who was a protege of Charles Judd, one of the top socialist professors at the University of Chicago. He was a Wundtian. He had studied under Wundt in Leipzig. As a matter of fact, that same era, the entry of the progressives into the system also meant the takeover of education by psychologists. All of these men were psychologists. Dewey was a psychologist. That's what he majored in at Johns Hopkins. Judd at the University of Chicago came out of Wundt's laboratory. The same thing at Teachers College, Columbia University. They were all steeped. James McKean Cattell came out of Wundt's laboratories. So this was the marriage between education and psychology. That's when it took place. That marriage took place at that time. Today, psychology so dominates American education that you could say that education no longer takes place. It's all therapy. All therapy. Has nothing to do with the development of the mind, of the intellect. Because if you deny children the means of learning language, their own language, then of course you make it impossible for them to really develop the intellect. Because what is the tool of thought? The tool of thought is language, you see. And if you have a deficiency in language, you're not going to be able to use that thinking skill very much. And that's why you find in America today such a much lower vocabulary level on the part of young people. I don't know if you've ever listened to some of these youngsters in the shopping malls, But their vocabulary consists of, a half dozen words or so, pizza, hot dog, hamburger, McDonald's, and a few four-letter words thrown in. That's about it, You never hear young people today having philosophical discussions, do you? When I was growing up, that was, we often got into these philosophical arguments. As a matter of most enjoyable thing when I was attending one of the homeschool conferences, I was watching these two 13-year-old youngsters who were homeschooled having a very interesting conversation on religion. I could not believe it. I hadn't heard anything like that in years. Very profound discussion going into all sorts of things. 13-year-olds. Today's public schoolers who are 13, they are so limited. They say that the American people are losing their vocabulary at 1% a year. 1% a year. This was a columnist in Texas who had read a study that was made at one of the Texas universities, at which they said the American people are actually losing vocabulary at a rate of 1% a year. Well, over a period of time now, it's been quite some time that we've had this look-say nonsense in our schools. Now, the interesting thing about the look-say nonsense is that it was recognized very early that this method of teaching produced reading problems. In 1929, Dr. Samuel T. Orton wrote an article for the Journal of Educational Psychology in which he said that this new sight method of teaching reading caused reading disability. There were all sorts of articles in newspapers and magazines about the decline in literacy. Why aren't our children learning to read? By 1955, you had Dr. Rudolph Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, in which he explained. He said they're not teaching reading correctly. He says they're doing everything wrong. They're totally illogical. He said you have to teach an alphabetic writing system alphabetically. So the educators have spent their time fending off these criticisms. They have tried to use all kinds of sleight of hand and sleight of words to defend their ridiculous position, and they've succeeded so well that even today, most schools in America today teach children to read by the Dewey whole word method. Now they call it whole language. So they keep changing the vocabulary, changing the fashions so that they can derail the arguments. They say, oh no, we're not whole word. We're not like the Dick and Jane books. We're different. And they all say they teach phonics. Because believe it or not, even the look-say people must teach some phonics. They have to. Just as the Egyptians had to invent some phonetic symbols, just as the Chinese have some phonetic values in their characters, so even our whole language look-say teachers have to teach some phonics, or else the kids would be totally stymied. They'd be reading nothing. But of course what they teach are phonetic clues. They don't teach systematic intensive phonics. They don't permit the child to develop an automatic association between letters and sounds. All they do is permit the child to use a letter to help him guess the meaning of a word. So for example, if he sees a word like horse, sees the H at the beginning of horse, he knows it can't possibly be baloney or something like that. It's got to be something that begins with H. On the other hand, the educators encourage the children to substitute words so that if they say pony for horse, that's considered correct, you see. Now, of course, you've got other elements coming into the destruction of language through deconstructionism from the universities, in which now children are taught to interpret what they're reading, because they are told that accuracy is not important. They're deliberately prevented from becoming accurate readers. They are encouraged to interpret what they are reading. In other words, they're encouraged to make up. I mean, whatever is there, I suppose, is a catalyst, or it's just a bunch of suggestions, but they are not required to stick to what the author means. So you can see what they've done is virtually destroyed literacy in this, and they're destroying it in this country. Now, of course, there are some children who do learn to read, who are taught phonetically in Christian schools, and here in the Chalcedon school, and in private schools and home schools. They are going to be the readers, and the readers will have the power. It's interesting that if you go back to the ancients, to Egypt, who had the power? The scribes, those who had the language. Those who didn't know how to read were disenfranchised. And that's what's happening in the United States. You see, they are creating whole millions of people who do not have the power of the written word, cannot use it, and are handicapped, crippled, and stymied by the fact that they do not have command of the written language. Those who do, of course, and Christians in general, certainly those who are in the fundamentalist movement and have to read the Bible, generally become good readers. And certainly the homeschoolers are aware of this, even though I notice that at more and more of these homeschool conferences, the larger they get, the easier it is for the other side to infiltrate, because I notice that in some of these conferences they're already teaching whole language to some of the parents, trying to get the parents to teach whole language and derail their children. Well, that's the background. Now what's happening today is, of course, you have this push for whole language, which is an accelerated means of destroying literacy in this country. And it's now being linked with outcome-based education, which is a total restructuring of American education to suit the goals of the humanists and the New World Order. And of course their aim is to produce an elitist society run by a university elite, such as now what we have now in the White House, Hillary and Bill, who now represent the standard of intelligence. You see, they're the elite, they're at the top, they represent the highest realm of intelligence in America. And so now you can understand why everybody else has to be so much dumbed down in order for them to maintain this illusion that they have intelligence. Of course, they have knowledge, but they have no wisdom. That's the problem with our government. I don't know a single person in the White House or in the cabinet who you could say is a person of any wisdom. First of all, they don't have the years. If you notice, they're all youngsters. They're all kids out of college. And look at Bill Clinton's culinary taste. It's all McDonald's. I mean, that's the level of his intelligence. He's also got a McDonald's mentality. So they are pushing whole language now, which is really the final, you might say, the final step in the destruction of literacy in this country. Meanwhile, we have made some very interesting discoveries. A friend of mine in North Carolina by the name of Edward Miller got in touch with me some years ago. He had read my book. He had read the NEA book in which I had discussed how the Russians, the Pavlov and Luria, how the Russians had devised techniques of artificially creating behavioral disorganization. The Russian psychologists wanted to know how to create behavioral disorganization, how to do it scientifically, and Luria wrote an excellent book on that subject, which was published in around 1933. And of course, the way they said you can produce behavioral disorganization by subjecting the organism to two conflicting stimuli. And that would produce behavioral disorganization. You could do it with dogs, and you can do it with human beings. And they do it with American children by imposing an ideographic teaching technique on an alphabetic writing system. So here is the alphabet is there, the writing system is alphabetic, it has some intrinsic shape, form, and yet you impose an opposing kind of view on it, a holistic, ideographic view, and you create a kind of cognitive conflict. And that cognitive conflict creates behavioral disorganization. And incidentally, you get frustration, you get delinquency. Most of the people in American jails can't read. They've all gone to school, but they've all come out functionally illiterate. They say about 85% of the prisoners in American prisons today are functional illiterates because it produces the kind of frustration that leads to delinquent behavior. And already there are studies that show a definite correlation between reading disability and delinquent, violent behavior. Now, I believe, for example, that those gangs in Los Angeles that were responsible for that conflagration was what you would say these functional illiterates who have no employable skills, that can't fit into our high-tech economy, totally frustrating, organizing themselves, and what are they engaged in? Drugs, theft, delinquency, violence, murder, etc. Because you see, each one of these functional illiterates harbors such frustration and anger against the society that made them that way, that they are little walking time bombs. Now, if you get 10,000 walking time bombs coming together, you get the kind of conflagration that you had in Los Angeles. Because they all went to public schools, and they know that something was done to them in the schools. Why do you think that schools are being burned down, vandalized? You don't burn or vandalize something that you love. When I was going to school, we had tremendous respect for our teachers. We loved our teachers. We loved the school because we felt they were doing us good. We came out of them smarter than when we went in. But today's kids come out dumber, you see. So they know something is being done to their minds. How do they know? Well, as you know, children are very intelligent. Every child has this enormous language learning ability. You know how children learn to speak. They develop, by the time they're ready to go to school, they've developed a speaking vocabulary in the thousands of words. Because during that early period of life, man gave human beings the power of speech. He gave us the power of the word. And as a matter of fact, the Bible says we were made in God's image. It doesn't mean that we look like God, but we have an attribute of God. We have the power of the word, you see. Now, so every child is imbued with this incredible language learning ability. And they feel very intelligent because the child's brain is probably more powerful than it will ever be in the later part of life. The child has a powerful brain. He does not have the knowledge, doesn't have the wisdom, but he's got the brain power. And that brain power permits that child to learn the language very rapidly, very accurately, and very beautifully, so that when they enter school, they feel very intelligent. You know how these kids are. They feel intelligent because they are intelligent. You see, they do have this incredible power. Now, they enter school, and because of the methods being used, these methods devised by the Soviet psychologists to create behavioral disorganization, these kids begin to experience something which they did not expect. See, they expected to be able to learn to read very easily the way they learned to speak. After all, wouldn't you say that learning to speak your own language at the age of 2 and 3 is a little more difficult than learning to read? And yet they enter school and they find themselves suddenly confronted with a system that doesn't make sense. They can't make head or tails of this. And they begin to experience frustration, and they begin to have doubts about their intelligence. Some of them think to themselves, gee, I'm not as smart as I thought I was. I'm pretty dumb, you see. So all of these children experience this. They know that something is being done to them. Now, some of these kids act up because what is being done to them is the equivalent of a non-surgical prefrontal lobotomy. So these kids know that something is being done to them, and they act up. Now, would you sit in a seat and behave if somebody was trying to cut your brain out? Would you just passively sit there and accept it? No, you would resist in some way. So these kids act up. And when they do, they gain the label attention deficit disorder. That's the big thing now in American schools is ADD, attention deficit disorder. Now, why are these kids acting up the way they do? Because they know something horrible is being done to them and they don't want to sit still for it. So what is the solution? Drug the little animals. So now they put them on Ritalin, which is being widely used throughout the United States. And this permits the educators to continue doing their work with a bunch of docile youngsters reduced to the status of some sort of little zombies. The system has become so evil that there's no possible way that it can be, quote, reformed, unquote. It's evil from top to bottom. And most of the teachers in the schools have no idea what they're doing. They've been taught to do things this way. They've been taught that children don't learn to read because there's something wrong with the children. As a matter of fact, the United States government is spending millions of dollars on research into the genetic causes of dyslexia. That's where the money is going. Now, this friend of mine in North Carolina, who is himself a dyslexic, had a terrible time learning to read, actually went to college, got a degree, and became an assistant principal in the public schools of Hollywood, Florida. Now, this man read my book on the NEA book, and he read that section on the artificial inducement of dyslexia through these processes, these interesting techniques developed by Luria and Pavlov. And he said, yes, that's what happened to me. He was certain of that. And he noticed that his grandchild was having the same problem, a reading problem. Was guessing words, was not able to read. And so he said, well, I'll get him some phonetic books and teach him phonics. You see, he had already knew enough about the two different methods of teaching and all of that. So he got his little grandson some phonetic little readers, and he found that this youngster had a block against phonics. And he wondered, now, how did this happen? This child hasn't been in school yet. He hasn't been exposed to these horrible teaching methods. How has he developed this block? Well, he noticed that his little grandson had all of these wonderful Dr. Seuss books in his little library there in the bedroom. And he realized that his grandson could read these Dr. Seuss books beautifully. Why? Because he had memorized them. In other words, he had memorized them as sight words. And because he had memorized these as sight words, he had developed a block against seeing these words phonetically. So this was a remarkable discovery, because I had been confronted with parents who understood what I was saying, that it was the reading instruction program that was causing dyslexia, and they would say, yeah, but my child had dyslexia before he got into school. How come? What's the cause of it? Well, this was the answer. Today's children are now memorizing these little books, these Dr. Seuss books. Now, the interesting thing about Dr. Seuss's books is that they were written to be read as look-say whole word readers. Dr. Seuss did not, make up these stories out of his head using his own words. He was given these words by the publisher. Let me read to you a quote from an interview that he gave to Arizona Magazine in June 1981. He says, quote, "They think I did it in 20 minutes. That darned Cat in the Hat took 9 months until I was satisfied. I did it for a textbook house, and they sent me a word list. That was due to the Dewey Revolt in the 20s, in which they threw out phonic reading and went to word recognition, as if you're reading Chinese pictographs instead of blending sounds of different letters. I think killing phonics was one of the greatest causes of illiteracy in the country. Anyway, they had it all worked out that a healthy child at the age of 4 can read so many words in a week, and that's all. So there were 223 words to use in this book. I read the list 3 times, and I almost went out of my head. I said, I'll read it once more, and if I can find 2 words that rhyme, that'll be the title of my book. That's genius at work. I found cat and hat, and I said the title will be The Cat in the Hat." And that's how The Cat in the Hat and Green Eggs and Ham and all these other books were invented. They were created as sight readers so that the children would memorize the words as wholes, so that when they entered the first grade and they had their look-say readers, they would already know how to read them, because the same words would be used. And so the teachers would be able to tell the parents, see how beautifully your child is learning to read. And everybody would be happy, and they wouldn't know that anything was wrong until the child got into the 3rd grade. You see, that's where usually where it becomes apparent that the child can't read. But so this was done, and Dr. Seuss wrote these books for these textbook publishers, and he understood what the problem was. He says it. Now, that doesn't mean that your child should not read Dr. Seuss's books. What it means is that you should teach your child to read phonetically before giving him anything to read, Dr. Seuss or otherwise, you see. But that's what they were doing. Now, my friend devised a very interesting test to prove that learning to read holistically, that is, words as wholes, created a block against phonics. So what he did was he took the words from the 2 Dr. Seuss books, Green Eggs and Ham and The Cat in the Hat, and he just put these words in alphabetical order. And then he took a second set of words from Dr. Rudolph Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read. And in that book, Dr. Flesch had a phonetic system of teaching reading in it, in which he had all the words regularly spelled, the short A and the short E's and all of that. Very simple, three-letter words or four-letter words, depending on the consonant blends. So we have the two sets of words, the sight words on the left, and or on one page, and then the phonetically regular words on the other page. And he tested, first he used the children of some neighbors of his. A phonetic reader could read both sets of words without any problem. But the sight reader could breeze through the sight words very nicely, almost 100% accuracy. But when he or she came to the phonetically regular words, which were just as simple, all of a sudden the speed slowed down considerably, many more errors, totally different kind of reading. So he was able to prove by this very simple test that the sight reader had developed a block of some sort, or simply didn't know enough phonics to be able to read these. In other words, what he said was, if you become an automatic, holistic reader, you have automatically developed a block against looking at words phonetically. And he took the same test and went to a local public school to see what the results would be. And of course the results were shocking. He tested 68 students at the Rhonda Klingman Elementary School, a rural public school in Wilkes County, North Carolina. And he found that of the 26 second graders, only 4 could be considered good phonetic readers. Of the 25 fourth graders, only 7 were phonetic readers, and the rest were holistic, or as he claimed, already educationally dyslexic. All in all, that came to about 72% of the children in this school in North Carolina were already educationally dyslexic. 72%. Now, that's a shocking discovery, because he said that if what is happening in the 4th grade in that school is typical of what's happening in North Carolina, then 72% of all the students in the public schools of North Carolina would emerge at the end of their school careers functionally illiterate, to some degree, some more than others. Some would have very severe reading problems, others would be considered maybe somewhat mild, provided they only had rather simple things to read. 2 years later, he went back to the same school. He wanted to retest these kids to see what had happened in the interim. And this is really where we got the objective proof that dumbing down was taking place. He was able to test 51 out of the original 68. Some of the others were not available. And he found that most of them were able to read the first grade. Now, this was the same test. He gave them the very same test that they had had the 2 years before. And he found that most of them were able to read these first grade words faster, and their accuracy had increased in the phonetic part of the test. But more than half of the dyslexic students miscalled some of the very same sight words that they had read correctly in 1990. One student, who as a 4th grader had made a total of 12 errors in 1990, made 29 errors in 1992 as a 6th grader on the identical test. A 1st grade test, they're reading more poorly in the 6th grade than in the 4th grade. In other words, this student read better in the 4th grade than in the 6th grade. And nowhere was the dumbing down process more obvious than among the good phonetic readers of the 2nd and 3rd grades of 1990 who were now in the 4th and 6th grades. Of the 13 students who had achieved the best scores in 1990, 9 made more errors on the very same test in 1992. One student who had made only 2 errors as a 4th grader in 1990 made 18 errors 2 years later as a 6th grader. Whereas he had missed no sight words in 1990, he missed 8 in 1992. Whereas he had missed only 2 of the phonetic words in 1990, he missed 10 in 1992. So obviously something was being done in that school which was dumbing down these kids. Now, what implications does that have for America if that is going on in virtually every school district in America? The dumbing down process is going on at a rate that it's frightening to think that this is occurring. And that is why now I tell parents, absolutely under no circumstances should you put a child in a public school. Under no circumstances. It is much too dangerous. Academically, it is very dangerous because they're destroying the minds of these youngsters. When 2 years later they're doing worse on a first grade test, that's serious. So I must thank Ed Miller for doing this because, as a matter of fact, because of this, we've worked on a method of remediation. The whole purpose now of remediation is to change a sight reader into a phonetic reader. How do you make turn a sight reader into a phonetic reader? Well, Miller made a very interesting discovery. He discovered that many of these sight readers have a great deal of phonetic knowledge. But that knowledge is not automatic. It's not automatic. In other words, their first way of looking at the words is holistic. And they only draw on their phonetic knowledge when they are forced to or required to. So he said, well, if we want to change a holistic reader into a phonetic reader, we've got to give him enough practice in phonetics, force him to use whatever phonics he has and teach him more so that he will become an automatic phonetic reader. So he's devised a very interesting methodology. What he has done is he's taken a text and he has blocked out all of the sight words, all of the words that children generally learn as sight words, and he has left only those words which the child must decipher phonetically. And in that way, the child will exercise, or the adult will exercise his phonetic knowledge, and if he does that often enough and intensively enough, then he will develop a phonetic reflex. A phonetic reflex as opposed to a holistic reflex. And he's been using this and trying it, and it's very successful. He's been able to shorten the time of remediation. He's been able to speed up the change from a holistic to a phonetic reader. So I think it's going to do a great deal of good in the future because we're going to have an awful lot of these holistic readers who are going to have to be trained to become phonetic readers, and this sight word eliminator does the job very nicely. And hopefully we'll be able to get that, or he'll be able to get it on the market. But the interesting thing is that he has gone to the government, the U.S. government, to Washington. He's applied for grants. He's done all the things. He's brought this whole business to the attention of the powers that be. And what do you expect that the powers that be have done? They've totally closed doors in his face. They've been rude. They've practically told him to get lost. They don't want to know how to do the right thing. Millions and millions of dollars are being spent to find the genetic causes of dyslexia when we know what the true cause is, that it's this method of teaching reading, and it's now sweeping the country. It's in all of the outcome-based education schools. I'm sure it's right here in Angels Camp. I mean, this is Vallecito, but in Angels Camp or Murphy's, wherever, throughout Calaveras County. I'm sure if you went into the elementary schools, the primary schools, you would find them using a form of whole language. Well, I will end here. I think I've given you enough and also brought you to the present. The present situation is that the public schools are dangerous. No child should be put in a public school, Christian or otherwise, because of what they're doing to destroy that child's ability to learn to read. They are determined to dumb down this nation to the point where we will be easily led into the New World pagan order. And the destruction of literacy is a most important part of their program, because they have to destroy the Americans' ability to read the Word of God. You see. Because Western civilization, Christian civilization, is based on the Word. It's based on God's Word. It's based on the Bible. And if you destroy the Word, if you destroy meaning through deconstruction and otherwise, you're destroying the basis of this civilization. They are trying to change this whole civilization. And they're using the schools in which to do it. And if we keep putting Christian children in public schools, well, it's going to just take that much longer to get out of this mess that we're in. Mark, do you want me to take questions now or afterwards? All right. We'll just throw this whole thing open to questions now. If anyone has any, I've given you enough information. But as you can see, it's a situation that is now so far gone. When people, when you find Christians talking about reforming the public schools or trying to take back the public schools, what's there to take back? You know, you can't take it back. We never had it, you see. That's it. We never had it. From the very beginning, it's been in the hands of humanists. Any questions? Yes, Mark.
You say this method of remediation is not yet marketed?
Yeah, he's working on it now, and he will be marketing it very shortly. Now, do you have children who come to this school from the public schools with reading problems?
Yes.
Every Christian school has that, you know. Now, what method do you use to remediate them?
Basically, we try to work some of the phonics into the reading program. Sometimes usually putting them in a simpler reader until they try to get them caught up. With phonetic method.
But you see, because of the block that they've acquired, this blockage against the phonetics, this method I think will help. This sight word eliminator, which will give the youngster much more practice in phonics, because he will not be seeing the sight words, so he will not be looking at some words holistically and then stopping and reading some phonetically. He will have to look at everything that he's reading phonetically, and this will speed up the remediation process. But we'll keep in touch, and I'll let you know when as a matter of fact, what he has done, he has taken one of Pat Robertson's books, a book on history, American history, and he is using that. He's actually gone to the publisher and had them publish an edition with all the sight words blocked out. And he's using that as the text. And it's a very interesting text. It's on American history. And he's using that, and also he's going to combine that with alphaphonics. Because many of these youngsters, while they have some phonetic knowledge, have real gaps. You know, they may know some of the consonants and that sort of thing, but they have real gaps in their phonetic knowledge. So it's a combination of first teaching them the phonetic system, then having them read through the sight word eliminator and getting that practice. And that'll eventually do the job.
We also have occasionally a student who will start at our school here, and they'll learn their phonics, and they'll do well, for instance, in a victory drill book or some other exercise like that, but they won't apply it. And I assume maybe that's the same problem. They have a block against it when they started their phonetic program.
Yeah, that because they have that block, they don't use the phonetic knowledge they have. It's not automatic, you see. As a matter of fact, he figured out at what point it becomes automatic. He said if the child can read holistically at 45, I think it's 45 words per minute or more, that child has established automaticity. And it's the automaticity that then creates the block against phonics. And he said what you have to do is create automaticity the phonetic reflex, before you can counter the holistic reflex. you see. So it's a matter of that having reached that point of automaticity.
It also seems to me that a child who learns the whole language method has to figure out their own method of sometimes learning to read. And some students are better than that than others, and they figure out how they're supposed to read basically on their own. And then you try to impose a system on them when they're already figured out on their own how to read, basically, because the whole word method is in effect somewhat subjective.
Yes.
And if they figure out a method to do that, they don't want to have somebody else's method imposed on them.
Well, that's true, and that's why you've got to explain to them that they will never become good, accurate readers. You know, the interesting thing about these holistic readers is that even if they become very efficient holistic readers, they have a tremendous dread of ever having to read aloud in public, because they never know when they're going to come across that word which they're going to look at and not be able to pronounce correctly. So they have nightmares about that. And I've received letters from people who have become pretty good holistic readers, but realize they have a handicap and are using whatever method they can to overcome this handicap, but have this dread of having to read aloud in public. You see, for example, you ask somebody to read verses from the Bible at church, and this individual, it may be functionally illiterate or have a reading problem, and they'll be very reluctant because they will. I remember once when a famous comedian, Rich Little, was he was on the Johnny Carson show. He was the guest host. Johnny Carson wasn't there, and he was given something to read, and it was just incredible. The poor man made all of these horrible reading errors. It was obvious that he was not a reader, and that he had made his career totally on memorization, on having an incredibly good photographic memory, but when given something to read was at a loss. And he made a lot of mistakes on some very simple newspaper article that he had been given to read. So, but that's the kind of situation, you see, where these people will go through life avoiding situations where they have to read aloud, avoiding situations where they will reveal their illiteracy. And a youngster like that, you've got to convince that youngster that, yes, he has devised this method of reading, which they do encourage, you know. But you have to explain to him that ours is an alphabetic writing system and give him the secret. You see, approach it from the point of view of, you know, this is like a code, a secret code, and I want to tell you a secret, you see. In other words, try to draw him in from a Sherlock Holmes point of view into becoming interested in our alphabetic system. That here's a system that's even better than the system that you have devised, you see. I mean, if they're young enough, they'll go along with you on that. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When these young minds are taught to see the word as a whole,
right,
does it carry over into other areas of their life? In other words, are they trained to see, not look at details, or just to see?
Yes.
Have you found?
And you know, I think it does. I don't know too much about the consequences of that, but it's obvious that, you see, when you're taught to read subjectively, to make up your own meaning, you don't have a sense of accuracy. Naturally, that's going to be applied to other parts of life. Sure, in learning anything, if for example, being a stickler on history. Now, as a historian, I'm very much aware of chronology. You must know what happened when, because, you know, you've got cause and effect. But it's much easier to teach these kids social studies in which everything is mixed up. You know, they got the Eskimos and the Egyptians and the Puritans all in one big mishmash, no sense of order. And so these kids are totally confused about anything. That's why they don't know history. That's why they have no idea, no chronological ideas. As a matter of fact, they're discouraging that in the schools. You've got to understand that this is being done on purpose to confuse the kids totally so that they will be putty in the hands of the controllers. Yes, I would say that probably is the case, that does happen.
No scientific evidence of dyslexia. No, I asked ask this question
Yeah.
because I was listening to the radio last week where a man had written a book, and I only caught just part of
Yeah.
it, but he said that there really wasn't any scientific evidence.
He said there wasn't
There
one.
wasn't any.
Yeah. There is none. Yeah. There are people who can't learn to read, but not because of, but because of problems that they have. I mean, a true dyslexic is so dysfunctional in other ways that you would realize that that person has very serious defects. I've trained a seriously retarded young man. The only way he could learn to read was phonetically, but even though he knew his phonics, his first way of looking at words was always holistic. In other words, a defective person tends to look at our words holistically as a natural form of reading. And it was only when he spelled the word that he got the phonetic sense. Now, we've known that since the early part of the century when there were studies made of how defective children learn to read as opposed to how perfectly normal children. The defective child would make the same kind of errors that today's dyslexic makes. In other words, today's normal children are being taught to read like defectives. They're being turned into defective individuals, and their brains are being made defective at the same time. Any other? Yes.
Well, I've had many people say to me, if your child can't read now when he's 6, usually by 9 he'll be able to pick up a book and just read it through.
Well, it depends. I mean, for example, if the child has not been damaged by any school and is simply on his own, it's quite possible, and he can figure out the phonetic system on his own, it's quite possible. You're talking about the better late than early syndrome. Yeah, oh yeah, there are many people in that. I've read Dr. What's his name? Who wrote that? Dr. Moore's book. Moore has no idea, no knowledge of the reading problem. He has no knowledge of why children have a reading. He assumed that the reason why children were having a reading problem was because they were immature. Their eyes weren't well developed or whatever it was. But we have discovered that children of 3.5, 4 years old can learn to read very nicely. Nothing wrong with their eyes, you see. It's just that Moore was not aware of the true cause of this reading problem. I've read his book, and in it he shows no knowledge at all of this business of phonics versus look-say. No understanding at all. And I think that he just decided, well, maybe the problem is maturation. You see. So he said, well, why don't you just wait? And the child will learn to read. But still, the child has to be taught to read phonetically. You see. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you very much. You've been very attentive, and thank you. It's been a delight and a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. Sam, subject, of course, is schooling, and in particular, reading. I'd like to take the subject a step beyond that to the effects on society of systems of education. We hear an awful lot about education. In fact, we hear too much for most of us. The teachers, after all, can only teach. It's up to the students to learn. An inattentive, lazy, rebellious pupil will not learn, irrespective of who the teacher is. Nero, after all, was taught by Seneca. And since one of the byproducts of narcotics is to transport you into a dream world and strange emotional states, it's obvious that no teacher in no school is going to be able to successfully teach students who take drugs or get caught up in fantasies of sex, which are now one of the byproducts of sex education. And we have this problem in our public schools because our social scientists who control the governmental educational system have systematically destroyed the authority of the teacher in the class in the name of social justice and equality. So the drunken, the stupid, the subnormal, the rebellious, and the criminally inclined, and there is such a thing, are promoted whether or not they keep up with the examinations. That is, at least up until recently. I understand from Sam that the system is going to change. Not for the better, but it's going to be different. Now, the word stupid really means somebody who determines not to pay attention to reality. Assuming that they have average intelligence, they have decided that they will not accept reality. And the old illusion that education alone would elevate the intelligence of a country is being disproven. We have ineducable students who are put into the classroom with normal children on the theory that this is only fair. Now, it is also, I think, interesting to note that education in the dictionary sense of the word, education as defined in Webster's second, unabridged, means book learning. But there are many students who prefer to work with tangibles, such as machinery, or in action, such as sports, or dancing, or painting, or music. Now, there are superior engineers, for instance, who simply skip a lot of schooling. And when a man goes to a corporation to get a job in an engineering department, his degree is not considered important. They ask him questions about the area of specialization in which they're going to hire him, and his answers will tell them very quickly whether or not he knows anything about the area. So he can't get in just by having gone to school. Percy Spencer, who was the wizard of Raytheon, company that I wrote a history about, only went to the 4th grade, and most of the patents in the company came from Percy Spencer's activities in the lab. So knowledge and education are two different things. Knowledge is defined by Webster as familiarity gained by actual experience, practical skill, technical acquaintance as a knowledge of life. Now, humanity, in other words, is too variable to be restricted to schools. We have to learn not only in school, but we have to learn in life, and we have to learn from other people, and we have to learn, most of all, from observation. The bookish student, who is the favorite of the professors, are not necessarily the most intelligent. And at the same time, education does not necessarily improve character. Macaulay said that most of our geniuses turned out to be great criminals who used their superior intelligence to mislead their contemporaries. So to be smart, so to speak, is not so good. I wrote books on 3 smart groups. One, James I of England, who unlocked and misdirected the Reformation. Robespierre of France, who of course you know became the leader of the terrorists. John Brown's financiers in the United States before the Civil War, the men who provided the money, guns, and inspiration for John Brown of Harper's Ferry, which helped lead us into the Civil War. So it's a rather different world when you look at it from outside the limitations of the classroom. I regard an individual who educates himself as superior to an individual who is educated by others. And in the United States, the opposite impression is widespread. If a person is self-educated, it's a put-down. it implies that he didn't come from a proper social class. Education, in other words, has achieved a sort of respectability in terms of status in this country, although the aristocracy of Europe never went to school, and still, in large measure, does not. That, of course, is a different standard. That's heredity, and that's class position. But if we are not self-schooled, if we do not continue our education after we leave school, then we are not truly educated people. And yet I meet corporate executives now who do not read outside the job. They read technical reports, they read market studies, they read everything that attains to the job, but nothing else. When I went to Europe on behalf of Black & Decker, the European businessmen said, as long as they're talking about the job, as long as they're talking shop, we sit on the edge of our chairs because they're brilliant and they know what they're doing. But the minute the subject gets beyond the company, there's a desert. They have nothing to say. They said they are so narrow. This, of course, is not what we would usually and traditionally consider educated people, and yet we're talking about men who spent a great many years in school and who are very successful on the job. So we go into what Sam talked about, the professoriate. The professors of the United States have established so much authority over us as a society that even individuals in a corporation who have proven that they're very good, very efficient, very intelligent, very diligent, in order to be promoted, have to be sent back to school. They go to the Harvard T course, and I've talked to a number of them who went through the course. It takes 2 years. And said, what did you learn? They said, well, I didn't learn a great deal, but made a lot of good contacts. They learned the language, of course. The MBA, the master's degree, you learn the language of business, and you learn the difference between a debenture and a note, the instruments of finance, and so forth. You learn the jargon, because every specialty now has its own language. But you do not learn any more about the world by the time you get through than you knew by the time you went in. Your education in that sense has not been broadened, it's been specialized. So we have special courses on every aspect of our activities, as we have licenses which enable us to go into these activities. Now, if we go into this in a historical sense, we're not taught history, as Sam says. History is now considered unimportant, irrelevant. There were different problems then. The scientists, for instance, are not taught the history of science. They're taught the conclusions of science, which makes it seem as though all of this was achieved through sheer brilliance and not through trial and error, because science is an empirical activity. Science is based on experiments. It's not based on theory. It's not based upon anything intelligence. It's based upon physical experiments in the lab. If you go into a laboratory in the average corporation or research institute, you will find yourself with a bunch of machines, and you'll find yourself with men and women in casual clothes, no white coats, and they are working with instruments that bubble or spark or do this or do that or do the other thing. It's a factory, in other words. So science is a jumped-up factory in which various products are discovered, or in many cases, undiscovered. You find most of the experiments, scientific experiments, go nowhere, and the paper simply tells you don't try that because it doesn't work. They can't tell you why it works, because that's not science question. We have electricity which we cannot explain. We can only know that if you do certain things, it evokes the power of electricity, and you can do certain things with it. But you don't know why, and you don't know what it is, and you don't know where it comes from. So you have certain illusions, we might say, about the nature of education and information. And we have the other point, and that is that different civilizations have different systems of education. We discover here, when we look at our system, that it takes an average of 7 years of postgraduate study to earn a PhD in an American university in any of the hard sciences. 7 years. Mathematics, engineering, things of that sort. An average of 12 years of postgraduate work to earn a PhD in the soft sciences, psychology, etc. Now, why the soft sciences should take longer to grasp than the hard sciences is because the soft sciences are filled with abstractions, and the hard sciences are filled with specifics. You can learn the specifics of engineering because they're apolitical, they're physical, they're tangible. To learn the specifics of psychology will take you a PhD an average 12 years. That's an average. That means that half of those who go take longer. Individuals do not emerge with a doctorate until they're either 40 or older at this rate. I've talked to those men and women, and it's very difficult to tell them anything because after all those years of schooling, they know all they ever want to know. And they don't want to be bothered with any more information from anybody, even one another. Now, this is true of Western Europe, of course, as well as ourselves. We have a more highly schooled population than has ever existed in the history of the world. More people going to school in the United States than any other society, and more people going to school in England and France, Germany, and the rest. But some of the results make you wonder. I met a young man in the university in South Africa who had transferred down there from Germany. He wanted to do his doctorate, wanted to do his dissertation on Luther. But the school, the college which he attended, he found that the library, the radicals in the library, the left wing in the library had gone in and taken out all the books on Luther and burned them. So therefore he had to go to South Africa to find relevant material on Luther. But he couldn't do a dissertation on Luther in South Africa either because the school universities have an interlocking agreement that anyone who is rejected as a PhD candidate in a certain area cannot become a PhD candidate in another university. So he could get the information, but he couldn't get the credential. Now this, of course, carries you into another area. Is what is education all about? What is the purpose? From a social point of view, from a societal point of view, what are we trying to do when we set up these great systems? Each civilization, of course, has a different purpose and sets up a different type of system. V.S. Naipaul, investigating the Islamic world in 1980, described the city of Qom in Iran. In Iran, the city of Qom has a number of seminaries, theological schools. Khomeini taught and lectured there before he was exiled, and he returned there when he went back to Iran. And the closest comparison I can say, well, we have a number of university cities. When I lived in San Diego, there were at least 3 or 4 universities in the city of San Francisco. There was a Catholic university, there was the University of California system, there was several. Oxford, however, might be a better example because the university dominates the town of Oxford. And the town of Qom, with its universities, is of course older than Oxford because Persia is much older as a civilization than England. In its day, It conquered Egypt, it rivaled Greece, it remained unconquered by Rome. Its very name evoked thoughts of high civilization for thousands of years. We don't think of it as such today, but nevertheless that's a historical fact. Today they have 14,000 students whose shortest period of study is 6 years. And Naipaul was told that's nothing. 15, 20, 30 years some people study. All universities, in other words, seem to attract eternal students. They hate to leave. It's a wonderful atmosphere. It's sealed off from the world and reality. And what do they study there? They study Arabic, grammar, logic, rhetoric, jurisprudence, Islamic philosophy, biographies, genealogies, traditions about the Prophet and his companions. One of the great teachers at Guam who still lectures and led prayers 5 times a day when Naipaul visited, had written 25 books of commentaries on one single work about the Shia idea of the Imam. Khomeini wrote 18 books. Now, of course, if we boil this down, the purpose of education, and education in your civilization, our civilization, is to enable you to progress in the world, enable you to do something with yourself, to make a success in some endeavor or field. So the education varies according to the field. I've never yet seen an article on what the mandarins of China used to study before they took their examinations. And the result of each examination, if you passed, was that you got a political job. And the higher the examination, the higher the political job you got, until you reached the stage where you would be next to the emperor. I don't know what they studied, what the examinations consisted of. I'm not sure that anybody in this part of the world is interested enough to have done an examination of it. But what interests me is the effect of education, because I, amongst other things, I write business histories of corporations, and I interview the executives in a corporation who tell me what their predecessors did, as well as what they themselves are doing. And of course, all corporations begin small and gradually get larger. That is the ones that I write about. Raytheon began with 1 man. Black & Decker began with 2 men. Ashland Oil began with 1 man. 1 man and 14 people. When I talked to them, they had 60,000 employees, and they were all around the world. So this is a fascinating area in which to examine and listen and learn and write up. But when I begin to run into most of these corporations were formed before World War I. Raytheon began, I think, a few years before the war. Ashland began just after the war. Black & Decker began in 1910. Some of the executives that I talked to who are dealing with the successful results are not the sort of men who would have started in 1910. They come out of the schools in which they all sound alike. And the originators of most of these firms were originals. Neither of the men who started Black & Decker went to high school, including the one who had charge of all the engineering and productivity. He had armies of engineers by the time he got through, but his son said to me, I don't really understand how he did it. He never explained it. But as a society, the education that Sam has described is leading us into some very strange water. In the 6 decades which followed the First World War, wrote Paul Johnson, knowledge expanded more rapidly than ever before. Yet, in many ways, an educated man was less equipped with certitude than an ancient Egyptian in 2500 BC. We know more and more, and yet we're much less sure of ourselves than ever before. Both my grandfathers were very sure of what was right, what was wrong, what constituted a man and what constituted a woman, what constituted good behavior and what constituted ignoble behavior. Both of them. In different parts of the world, they grew up in different levels of education. One went to the 6th grade, the other went farther. I've forgotten how far. One was on a higher level than the other in terms of career, but they both had the same general ideas. They were both born in 1860. So they matured, let's say, in the first generation of your life, you generally mature. The first 30 years, they were mature at 1890. Both were married and had children, and were able to lead successful lives. I've never since World War II, I keep running into people whose ideas vary wildly, if they have any, that they want to discuss. Most of the times they don't want to talk about it. They want to talk about the job. At least, said Johnson, the ancient Egyptians had a clear cosmology, that is, idea of the heavens. In 1915, Mr. Einstein came along and destroyed Newtonian physics and launched the theory of relativity, which doesn't explain anything. The savants, he says, of the 20th century then proceeded to demolish logic as a fixed structure of reason by introducing, quote, many-valued logic, quantum logic, presuppositional logic, minimal logic, deontic logic, and tense logic. Now, our grandfathers only knew logic. Meanwhile, many of the predicted events of the most highly praised philosophers and thinkers of modern times, most of their predictions did not come out. The Bible tells us you can tell a false prophet by the results. If the results do not fit his predictions, you know the prophet is false. So we have scholars of very high stature who have made predictions about the course of events. If they didn't come out, what can we say about them? Nietzsche predicted that religion would transform into politics and the will to power, but he didn't anticipate that religion would coexist with politics and power. It wouldn't disappear. It's still here. We've seen the revolution in Iran, which was religious in nature, so therefore Nietzsche was out of his mind to say that religion was going to disappear because there was a power drive by some group or another. One set of facts in this area doesn't obliterate another. Islam was revitalized by oil revenues, foreign aid, and modern technology, and it set about to expand through terror, which was its old method. Idi Amin destroyed thousands in his campaign to Islamize Uganda. Gaddafi dropped napalm on Chad. But in the meantime, the pilgrims fly to Mecca on chartered jets. And the old arguments, despite the jets, between the Sunni and the Shia, and the Druzes and the Ismailis and the rest, continue the same as ever. This is a world, a civilization that's using all the modern artifacts that we have produced without changing any of its ancient ideas. The Shah of Iran tried to modernize the country, and as a result was overthrown. Not necessarily because they wanted Khomeini, but because he was interfering with their lives. He was destroying villages and putting up superhighways. He was putting up factories. He was making collective farms out of the farms and taking the land away from the people. He was trying to socialize the culture of the country. And it got to the point where he wouldn't leave any group alone. And as a result, when Khomeini blew the whistle, they went along with Khomeini. If it had been somebody else, they would have gone with somebody else, in my opinion. But in any event, they went with Khomeini, who restored the ancient rules of the Mohammedan world. What he did was interesting to think about. He slaughtered 123 generals, 400 other army and police officers, 800 civilians, 700 followers of rival ayatollahs, over 1,000 Kurds, 200 Turkomans, many Jews, Christians, Sheikhs, Sabaeans, and members of other sects. Now, this is a fellow who wrote 18 books. So he was an educated man. And I just mention this because the old idea that education means virtue is not necessarily so. And some of our ideas about education are what we have to alter if we want to have a better society. Now, our State Department and our businessmen who went back and forth to Iran in great numbers, some of my friends in the oil company that I wrote a history about, spent 8 years trying to make a deal with the Iranians. They wanted Iranian oil and they wanted to pay for it. They just wanted to be sure they could get it. So they offered all their properties in the state of New York, which were extensive and very expensive, in return for an agreement to be supplied with oil at market prices for a period of years. Well, every time they reached what they thought was an agreement with the Iranians went back to Tehran and talked to their superiors and would return and use that agreement as the basis for a new series of arguments, because they could not understand that in a business negotiation, both parties have got to profit. They resented the fact that they thought the company was going to profit. They wanted to be the only ones to profit, and it never seemed to occur to them that no man in his right mind would make a deal in which he wouldn't get anything. They insisted that it was possible to argue you into that position, so that our whole civilization is based, our whole commerce, our whole system of commerce is based upon an underlying assumption that they could not grasp. Business is based on a system of honor. If you order a tank full of oil, or a tanker full of oil, at a certain price over the phone, and you say, fine, I'll buy it, I'll pay for it, you put down the phone. In the interim, before it's delivered, the price has changed. Well, you still pay the price that you offered to pay. The whole system of commerce is based on a system of honor. The Americans are being taught that business and commerce is based on cheating. It's based on taking advantage of you. How are they taking advantage of you when they give you goods for your money? You don't have to buy the good if you don't like the price. This whole thing is presented, in other words, our commerce is not presented in a factual way. It's not presented in a realistic way. Very young people who go to work for various corporations think that the way to get along is to butter up the boss, and they're very surprised when they're fired, because the boss didn't hire them to be buttered up. He hired them to do a job and to tell the truth, because if their report from the field is not factual, he will make decisions based on a fantasy that's been reported to him, and he'll soon find out, because he'll lose money, that that was a false report. So, of course, that individual is absolutely useless. So what we are looking for when we look at education is an education that teaches students, teaches children the realities of life, what the world is all about, to rely upon your observation and not upon what you're told. If you're told that something is good and you see on every hand that it is not working, and you can go around telling other people that it's good, you have not been properly taught. There's no point in going along with illusions. Now, what did it mean as a civilization? The fall of Rome, which has as many causes apparently as it has commentators, the causes of the fall of Rome were considerable. There were a great many. It was almost like looking at a man who dies after several visits to the hospital. By the time he dies, you could write several pages of what was wrong with him, and you could say each one of them was the cause of his death. But generally speaking, the whole machinery collapses. He's got everything wrong with him. He's got high blood pressure, he's got a bad heart, he's got this, he's got that, the other thing. Rome reached that condition. Amongst the causes of its structural collapse was first It had grown up by conquering other peoples and then taking away everything that they had. So that kept it in this period of spurious prosperity for a couple of centuries. When it ran out of countries to conquer and steal from, it was forced to take care of itself, and it had never figured on that. It was a military dictatorship after all. So they had no system of taking care of themselves. And as time went on, they began to impoverish all the families and the citizens by heavy taxation, because if they couldn't steal from some conquest, then they might as well steal from the citizens. So they began to tax the citizens everything you can think of. The citizens, therefore, became impoverished. And across the board, parents were no longer able to afford to hire a teacher for their schools. So one of the things that happened was that they began to run out of clerks. They really couldn't even keep up the records. Now, if we expand illiteracy the way Sam has described it, who's going to keep things running? What are we going to do with all those books gathering dust in the libraries? Well, of course, we're closing down the libraries. We're saying that libraries are a luxury. Libraries are the sustenance of the people. I educated myself in libraries. I spent some of the best years of my youth in libraries, public libraries, studying, reading, anything that interested me. I would pursue. If I found an author I liked, I'd get every book he ever wrote. Now, for at least 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, and the fall is generally over-exaggerated in terms of collapse, many parts continued, but let's say the fall of Rome in the 5th century, up to the 15th century, all the Christian teachers were connected to the church, and they taught Latin, but they also taught the reasons that Rome fell. This was paramount, that if a society does this and this and this and this, it will collapse. It was the Renaissance that decided that really Rome had been great and revived the whole theory, the licentious behavior, the sex, so forth, which the church had restricted. They brought back torture because that was what the Romans did. They brought back political despotism because that's the Romans did. The Romans never elected anybody. They had no votes. They had no rights. They were supposedly free from torture when St. Paul was alive, but after that, torture returned for everybody, citizen or no. They had slavery, they had human sacrifice. They were a despicable civilization. Elegant barbarians, I called them at one point. At any rate, the Renaissance brought back torture. It removed political rights. They lost the right which they'd had during the Middle Ages, not to be taxed without their own consent. They lost many of the rights which this country was founded on and which we have lost. In other words, they forgot the errors of Rome. The children were taken out of the common school, which the church used to maintain, and put into Latin schools for the upper class. And the common schools was for the common people. And they had to speak only in the idiom of Italian or French, only in the dialects. And the regime as a whole, the savants, the scholars, could talk to one another in Latin. So the common language was below, and Latin was above. They restored, and they tried to restore the past, but nobody can ever restore the past. What they restore was their idea of the past, which was not based on realistic facts. And Italy was where it began to go in a very strange direction. Machinery improved, systems of navigation improved, they rediscovered perspective in drawing, they rediscovered the principles of architecture to a certain extent, but the life of the people began to get criminal. Poisons, murders, violence in the street. It became unsafe to go out at night, and in some places even in the daytime. Only the wealthy could afford the bodyguards that were essential. And I thought about that when I was visiting Kerr-McGee Corporation in Oklahoma City. They have underground tunnels there because the winter and the winds are so bad. And in these underground tunnels they have restaurants and shops and so forth, and it's very convenient. Downtown you can walk all around in these tunnels. And I went around a corner and I saw a man appear who looked like a cop immediately in plain clothes, and then another one. And then in between them came the head of Carr-McGee Corporation. He had to travel with 2 bodyguards. He couldn't walk around the streets alone. And I thought about the Renaissance. I think about it when I go to New York, when it isn't safe to go out on the street at night. And in fact, not just New York, but almost any city. You look out your hotel window and there are empty streets. There's nobody out. It's not safe. And this is what? The highly educated United States with all these universities and all these schools. Well, the Renaissance ended really with the Reformation. And the Reformation began, very interestingly, with only a handful of men. You had Calvin, you had Luther, you had John Knox, you had a few others. They only were on the stage an average of 20 years before they died, 20, 25 years. And yet for a full century, Europe put itself back together based on faith. Even the Mediterranean culture had to go back to the faith. The Vatican had to clean up its act. And that was enough to run us for centuries. Almost like these companies that I've described started by 1 or 2 men that have been now running for decades on the originality and the energy of their founders. Now, the purpose of learning, purpose of education is to teach you a skill, enough skill so that you can make a living. To bring it down to earth, that's what education is all about. The purpose beyond that is to gain knowledge. And if you gain knowledge, then you understand how to control your own weaknesses, how to earn a decent living, how to understand the world with all its imperfections as it is and not the way you would like to see it. And hopefully, if you live long enough, to reach some wisdom. Now, that sounds like a lot. Nobody can teach it all. But you can set children on the path to discover it. Because, as I began, the student has to learn. And that responsibility cannot be assumed by somebody else, nor can the guilt of its failure be taken. They don't always come out the way they're supposed to. And it's not the fault of the parents. If the parent has been diligent in trying to see to it that the student is placed in the proper hands. Of course, there is now, I think, some question on homeschooling and on Christian schools. Where do you send them after high school? Or where do you send them to college? Most of the colleges are not really worth sending them to, although you run into certain areas where it's difficult to avoid. I remember my grandfather, Philip Scott, when I told him that I didn't intend to follow my father's educational plan, said, "What do you plan to do?" I said, "Well, what do you want to be?" I said, "Well," he said, "Of course," he said, in our branch of the Scott family, we don't go to college to become gentlemen. That's an English idea." He said, what do you want to be? Unless he said you want to be a certain skill. He said, "I think a physician has to go to college," that sort of thing. I said, "Well, I want to be a journalist." He said, "An American journalist?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Education's not necessary." And as it turned out, he was right. Now, it would be very difficult today for a young person to make their way when you're faced with corporations that require credentials before they even interview you. And there's only a handful of schools, as far as I know, that we could generally recommend on the college level. But we don't know all the schools in the country either. There are thousands of them, thousands of colleges, many of them small, and some of them are bound to be good. We know a few that are good, but we don't know a great many. But an unfashionable small college, usually worth looking into, because they're not trying to impress the world. They're just trying to do their job, as a general rule, and I think there is a good chance there. But if the child doesn't go to college, then what? Well, then you have all the other areas. You have the arts, in which college is considered really ridiculous. I've never met the product of a writing class yet in any of the areas of communication that could do very well. Writing seems to be beyond, of course, you learn to write on a small level, elementary level. What you do with that is something else, and that's very difficult to teach. Creative writing courses, I don't know. What do they create? I don't know. Painting, you generally have to go to a technical school to learn. Dancing, you have to go through the hard mill of the exercise in the professional company. If you're going to be a mechanic, you can certainly don't have to go to school to be a mechanic. You can learn on the job, as most mechanics do, and most engineers do. So the Christian, confronted with a national educational system that is designed to destroy his faith and the faith of his children, and the position of Christians in our society today. We hear complaints now that a person is bringing religious values into the discussion of public issues, which comes very close to taking away your constitutional rights to be a citizen among others. If the child learns to read, he goes through a doorway of learning. And this is where, of course, Sam's comments, I think, are so terribly valuable, because you can educate yourself. Why not? If you're not going to use your own intelligence, whose will you use? If you don't follow your own vocation, what then? Everyone I've ever known who didn't follow his own vocation turned out to be miserable on the job and miserable at the job. And we all know in our heart, as time goes on, what our vocations are. So to follow your own potential, to follow your own, what attracts you for a reason. And to teach that sort of independence, I think, is the best schooling of all. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Yes, Casper.
Well, I never think of that. I figure the people are so relieved when I shut up.
I wanted to ask you about the schools of journalism. Today, I guess you can't get a job, say at the New York Times or Washington Post, unless you come out with a degree from a school of journalism. Is that it?
That's right. I was very fortunate, of course, in the era in which I applied in New York. I had some newspaper experience by the time I went back to New York. And the fellow said, "What school of journalism did you go to?" And I said I didn't go. And he said, "Well, you see all those men waiting to be interviewed. They all went. Why do you think you're better than they are?" I said, "I don't." He said, "Well, why did you have the nerve to come in?" I said, "Well, I can do the work." Well, he said, "We'll give you a chance." And I was very lucky. But it's true, you cannot get on a paper, or generally. But it's true and it isn't true. When I ran into a slack period in New York in the 60s, just before I went on a magazine, I was interviewed by Business Week. It was Newsweek. I was interviewed by Newsweek business editor. And he didn't ask me where I'd gone to school, because I was already mature. and I already had a record of something. And he was going to send me out in the same old way on an assignment. And if I worked the assignment, I would have gone it. So writing, communications is not quite as tight. None of the creative areas, publishing, advertising, newspapers, magazines, I suspect radio and television also. I don't think that they're generally bow down before the credentials as much as the corporations do. There is still room. There will always be room for bright people.
They can always create their own newsletters.
Well, that's true. And if you have that sort of self-confidence, you're generally, it accompanies the fact that you can do things and you know you can do them. And personnel departments are made to be outwitted, and so are governments, so are school systems. I guess that's it.
I shall be speaking only a very, very few minutes. I enjoy my lunch, and much as I enjoy speaking, I hate to be late for lunch. So I won't keep you very long. What I have to say is, in a sense, a supplement to what Sam had to say earlier. How did Adam learn how to speak? Did he start out grunting? Did Adam and Eve run around the Garden of Eden grunting at each other? God made all things, and he looked at everything, and he said, "It is very good." Adam and Eve were obviously created with a knowledge of language and the power to speak it. After all, we meet with them in Genesis 1-3, talking. God talks to them, they understand him. They talk to each other, they answer God. So very, very obviously, God created them with the total power of speech. Sin has been responsible for the dumbing down of people ever since, so that you developed peoples who lost their literacy after a time. In fact, if you go back to the era not long after the flood, you find that they obviously brought over some technology, knowledge of it. You go to Mohenjo-Daro in India and you find they had modern plumbing, and that's about as far as you can go back in Asia. In the European world, you go back to Crete, Knossos, and the hot and cold running water and the flush toilets are startling to see. But they were lost. So, man began created without sin, with a high order of intelligence, and he went downhill. What about literacy? Well, a few years ago, about 1960, a brilliant English scholar, and I believe he was head of the British Museum for some time, as was his father, I think, before him. Father and son were ornaments of British scholarship. But this man, Donald J. Weisman, W-I-S-E-M-A-N, wrote a book titled Early Discoveries in Ancient Babylonia. I really don't know what Weisman believes, if anything, because it's a series of archaeological and linguistic studies. The book created shockwaves, I know, because I never found anyone who wanted to admit that the book was important or comment on it. It was reprinted in the 80s, but both times without any public notice, either in Britain or here, to the best of my knowledge. Well, what did Weissman discover? He found, in studying some of the ancient bits of writing known to man, a number of words. And the further he went back, the older, the more clear-cut the meaning was. One of these words, which appears 5 or 7 times in the book of Genesis, is a Hebrew word translated to the best of the knowledge of the translators in their time as generations. These are the generations of Adam, of Noah, and so on. But what Weissman found when he went back to the ancient tablets and all was that the word more accurately means these are the family records, not generations, the family records. So what he concluded, what we have in the book of Genesis is a series of family records that have been put together. These are the family records of Adam and of others, one after another, put together, and that's the book of Genesis. Well, this was a mind-blowing discovery and not very pleasing to anyone in the modernist camp, and not very pleasing to those who were orthodox, because obviously this was something that was a bit too devastating. It pointed too much to something that would be so radical a break with accepted scholarship that it was best to pretend it didn't exist. A few scholars have footnoted Weissman's book without any reference to what it meant, just put it in a footnote with a series of other citations to indicate, I know about it, but I don't want to consider it. That's a good way to bury something that is totally against what you believe. But what Weissman's discovery told us was this: God created all things very good, including man. He was talking with man. And he gave man somehow the ability to record things. Because the faith we hold is different from all other religions in the world, in that at the heart of it is literacy. Literacy. That's why Christian schools are so essential. Our faith stresses literacy. And with what Weissman discovered, that literacy began at the beginning. That's an embarrassing fact to those who want to begin with a grunting Adam, a grunting Eve. It just is impossible for them to fit into their system, because if you're going to accommodate Charles Darwin and somehow straddle both worlds, and you're somehow going to push Adam way, way back into a remote ancestry, eons back, you don't want to confront an Adam who is only about 6,000 to 7,000 years behind us, and who in terms of these discoveries kept a family record. And these family records were compiled What this tells us is that man isn't that different now from what he was then. He's gone astray at times, but essentially he's the same man. And it re-emphasizes the centrality of literacy and education in our faith. Unlike every other religion in the world, totally unlike any biblical faith, is a faith that stresses literacy. It's the religion of the book. God taught Adam how to talk and how to write. Well, women have been talking ever since, and so have men. Because it's a gift of God. It's a means of communication and of communion. And at the central, at the heart, the central aspect of our faith is the rite of communion. The proclamation of the Word of God and communion. Community in Christ. This is why when you have what Sam Blumenfeld has so very aptly termed the dumbing down of America, you have the disintegration of Christianity and the return of paganism, which stresses feelings, not faith. Literacy doesn't mean anything in Gaia worship. Never has. But literacy and speech are at the heart of our faith. Every now and then somebody sends me a clipping, or I encounter somewhere something about how with all the automation and so on, we're going to get beyond the world of literacy because things are actually, I'm told, going to be devised that are going to render books and writing obsolete, that we're going to reach a state where machines are going to do the kind of thing that now is done for us by our mind and by our tongue. I don't believe it. It's God's world. I think the book and books, the Bible and all other books, are here to stay. I don't think the books written by Otto and Sam and myself are going to pass away with a marvelous burst of some kind of computerization and some kind of H.G. Wells scheme for the future. They're here to stay. That is why the Christian school and the Christian home school are so important. Ours is the religion of the Word, of literacy. And this is why it will be the dumbing down of any people and of the world if they abandon that faith, and their destruction. And this is why, because we are training our children and our children's children in literacy. The future belongs to us under God. Well, I promised you you'd get out early for lunch, so enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
Would you like to close in prayer?
What?
Would you like to close in prayer for all of us? Would you like to close in prayer?
Oh, yes, by all means. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Our Father, we thank Thee that Thou didst not make us into grunting animals, but into creatures made in Thine image, with knowledge, righteousness, holiness, and dominion, with a calling to proclaim the Word, to be a literate people, and to bring all things into captivity to Jesus Christ, the Word. Bless us mightily as we seek to restore the Word and words